Good morning and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. So, for those of you who have clicked on this video because of the FAA news, just want to make one thing perfectly clear. This is definitely something to be expected. If anything about this launch had gone even slightly awry, unless Starship had made a perfect ascent to space and left the launch pad behind unscathed, all of that. If any result other than that one came up, then we would have expected the FAA to ground Starship. So this is to be expected. However, if you look at a lot of the media headlines that have been rearing their ugly heads lately, you would think that something very, very serious was going on right now, that the local populace was turning against SpaceX, that the honeymoon is over, that people are terrified, getting into an uproar after discovering a deposit of dust on their vehicles deposited by Starship, something that they weren't expecting. All of those things are untrue. There are certainly some people who are upset around here, and there's reason to believe that the FAA are going to make a number of demands on SpaceX, perhaps quite a number of demands, but in my view, this is a good thing. This is an opportunity for SpaceX to do things properly this time. All of that having been said, though, it's also important to keep in mind that everything that happened during the launch, immediately after the launch, the result was significantly worse than was anticipated, than the sorts of impacts that were laid out in the PEA, the spread of debris, the spread of dust, all of these sorts of things, the impact on the environment were significantly worse than were anticipated in the PEA, with the possible exception of a pad explosion. If something like that had occurred, then the PEA anticipated widespread impact, but all we had was just a regular launch, and we had widespread impact, and that's something that the FAA did not really anticipate, and so therefore there needs to be an investigation. But we should not confuse an investigation for a long-term ban on future flights from Boca Chica. That has not happened. However, I think it's very important that we have a look at everything that did transpire, at least as far as we know up to this point, and how that differs from what the FAA laid out in the PEA in the first place. And also, given the fact that there is such a substantial difference, what kind of impact is that going to have on SpaceX's future plans here, and when are they going to be allowed to launch again?
Estamos despegando, miren todo el fuego, todo el humo, no se escucha el sonido todavía. Miren lo grande que es. ¡Wow!
The FAA ground Starship after explosion, spelling bigger troubles for SpaceX. The FAA let SpaceX launch Starship without the usual pad protections. SpaceX Starship explosion spread particulate matter for miles. Shocking images show Elon Musk's doomed Starship rocket spray debris over Texas coast. Starship launch video captures flying debris and destruction. And my personal favorite, SpaceX's Starship kicked up a dust cloud, leaving Texans with a mess. Really? The Mexicans just across the border, they didn't have a mess, only Texans? And was it all Texans, or most Texans, or some Texans, or perhaps a few hundred Texans in Brownsville who were especially close to the launch? Of course, the media doesn't spell any of that out. Instead, they want everybody to believe that SpaceX has brought widespread destruction and devastation to this region, and the locals are in an uproar. Now, the story that I am the most concerned about is one that was entitled "An Author Believed Elon Musk Would Benefit Brownsville." Not anymore. This is the perspective of a local author in the region who at first was very enthusiastic about SpaceX moving into the region, but now has lost his enthusiasm. The fellow's name is Domingo Martinez, and the article details his opinion thusly, quote, "When I heard that SpaceX was considering Brownsville versus Florida, I was rooting for Brownsville," Martinez says. "At the time, SpaceX was promising to revolutionize extraterrestrial science. Its CEO, Elon Musk, was on a charm offensive, and we all fell for it," Martinez says. The true cost of SpaceX's move to Brownsville wasn't yet known. Martinez read the Federal Aviation Administration's environmental impact statement while writing Countdown to Liftoff, but he says that despite the document's hundreds of pages of research, appendices, and comments, it fell short of predicting the full effect launch failures would have on the region. There has been noise pollution that scares away the migratory birds that attract bird-watching winter tourists from all over Texas and beyond, the scattering of debris from equipment explosions, and fuel drops in the Gulf of Mexico. Martinez says that Brownsville residents expected there to be some environmental impacts, but few expected it to be so immediate. Looking back at Countdown to Liftoff, which was Martinez's first article that actually supported SpaceX's move to the region, Martinez says he regrets giving SpaceX the benefit of the doubt back then. "It feels like we sold our souls." He especially laments the loss of his once pristine patch of paradise. Future generations aren't going to experience the freedom of being alone in Boca Chica. Gone perhaps are the days of driving to the beach in a pickup truck full of beer, wood, and meat. "That was a great weekend," Martinez says. "I'm afraid that with the introduction of SpaceX, that's not going to be possible for very much longer." Now, I want to be 100% clear here. I've spoken to many Brownsville residents during my time here, especially people who come into contact with large numbers of other Brownsville residents. And in general, there isn't this kind of uproar, at least as far as I can tell. I haven't taken a scientific poll of the area, but in general, nobody that I've spoken to thus far looks upon this entire development as a massive cataclysm. And while we're talking about pristine patches of paradise and driving to the beach in pickup trucks full of beer, wood, and meat, well, there's also an impact that you're going to see right here. A lot of trash, a lot of stuff being left behind by people partying in the area. Now, is this a recent development? Something that's only happening because of the tourists that have come to watch SpaceX launches? In my opinion, no. The piles of beer bottles and other debris that I've seen on the Boca Chica beach, in my view, probably did not suddenly magically appear when SpaceX moved to the region. Now, I'm not saying that locals do this, but tourists have been coming to Boca Chica Beach for a very long period of time. And some of these tourists, together with some locals, perhaps some teenage kids, are simply not respectful to the beach, are not considerate, and pretty messy. As a matter of fact, I found more beer bottles on Boca Chica Beach than I have ever seen at Folly Beach in my home state of South Carolina. Now, is this a brand new development? Well, once again, according to the people I interviewed, no, not at all. Now, an increased number of tourists may indeed be contributing to an increased amount of trash on the beach, and of course, all of this concrete recently doesn't help, but the fact remains that Boca Chica Beach was not a pristine patch of paradise completely clean of the impact of man prior to the arrival of SpaceX. At least that's my opinion, although I can't say that with absolute authority. I've also been very disappointed to discover that the media has been engaging in absolute distortions as well. For example, take this quote from the Daily Beast, quote, "The launch also caused chunks of concrete to fly into and pummel nearby buildings and infrastructure," okay, "as well as a car parked miles away." The car in question belongs to Lab Padre and was parked directly across the street from the launch pad, as most of you probably know. And yet, of course, this is something that the uninformed readers of the Daily Beast are probably completely unaware of. This sort of thing doesn't help. In my opinion, the damage caused by the Starship launch was bad enough without exaggerating things. And by bad enough, I mean that the impact of this launch was substantially worse than projected even when anomalies are concerned. Let me give you a direct quote out of the PEA. Quote, "A Starship Super Heavy anomaly could result in an explosion on the launch pad, which would spread debris. Debris is expected to be contained within the debris study area, which is a 700-acre area within the all-hard checkpoint area. SpaceX's SN11 anomaly created the largest debris field of all launch anomalies to date, and although debris spread outside the launch pad, it was contained to the debris study area. This is absolutely not the case with this launch. And keep in mind, this is not a pad RUD. This is not an airburst explosion. This is just the normal functioning of Starship's engines. And yet, substantial debris clearly reached an area far beyond the 700-acre study region, and as a matter of fact, hit the ocean in large quantities. This is something that the FAA didn't even begin to anticipate. Of course, SpaceX probably didn't anticipate it either. How much worse might it have been if Starship had exploded on the pad and substantial debris, not just dust, traveling as far as 10 kilometers from the launch site? And again, if you think I'm exaggerating, pick up a book sometime or just look up N1 explosion, that is to say, the second launch of N1, and see how far that rocket spread debris in the aftermath of its explosion. Far, far worse than what we're seeing, obviously, at Boca Chica. So here are the conditions that SpaceX has to abide by in the event that something like this occurs. Quote, SpaceX has entered into a memorandum of agreement, or MOA, with the TPWD, or Texas Park and Wildlife Department, to mitigate and restore any impacts from anomalies at Boca Chica State Park, Brazos Island State Park, and other TPWD land. The MOA provides a protocol for responding to events, recovering debris, and implementing, monitoring, and adapting restoration efforts to restore impacts. It is expected that any affected land can be restored, and long-term impacts to the natural, cultural, and recreational values of TPWD lands and habitat would be avoided. Additionally, SpaceX must obtain a special use permit on an emergency basis from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as applicable for cleanup activities for any anomaly debris on refuge, fee-owned, or managed lands. And in the aftermath of the SN11 anomaly, SpaceX and the FAA also came up with certain protocols to do cleanup work in an area called the algal flats, and you're looking at an example of that right now, which includes grooming of tracks with use of hand tools and ambient soils to prevent further impacts, removing fill, establishing the proper slope within the tidal range, and inoculating the soils with a mixture of the dominant algal species or any other approaches determined by the TPWD and agreed to by SpaceX. In other words, just the process of cleaning up everything you're looking at right now has to be done very carefully and not with big equipment. So all of these things are going to take a substantial amount of time, and not only that, SpaceX has to give certain assurances that this is not going to happen again. As I've said numerous times in the past, I do not see how this can possibly be done without the implementation of some kind of flame trench similar to what NASA has been using at Cape Canaveral for decades. Once again, I'm not sure why SpaceX didn't do this in the past, although I'm pretty sure it has something to do with the environmental impacts of such a structure and the fact that the FAA would have made things far more complicated for SpaceX SpaceX if they had tried to do this sort of thing in the past, but now the consequences are extremely clear. SpaceX is going to have a lot of talking to do to try to convince the FAA that a water-cooled metal plate of some kind beneath the launch pad without a flame trench can somehow produce a safe launch that is free of this kind of debris. I think that's going to be an uphill battle, to say the least, and even that is going to require a fair amount of construction and also the introduction of either a water pumping station or a very sizable water tower in order to keep the water pressure up sufficiently so that Starship doesn't just melt the metal plate in the space of a few seconds with its incredibly powerful Raptor 2s. To say that SpaceX has a difficult path ahead of them would be the understatement of the year. However, that having been said, I also feel that this is an opportunity, that the FAA's list of action items that are no doubt going to be demanding are also going to require SpaceX to do everything right this time around. And the public, in my view, are also willing to give SpaceX that chance. Contrary to what the media would like us to believe, I don't sense a general groundswell of opposition to Starship. Instead, most of the public still recognizes the amount of business, the amount of revenue, the amount of tax dollars that SpaceX is bringing to this region and the benefits that go with it. I believe that they are willing to give SpaceX another opportunity as long as they do their due diligence. And the FAA, if they do their job, is going to make sure of that, which means that it could be a substantial period of time before SpaceX can launch again. But when they do, it's going to be a lot safer this time around. Smash that like, hit that subscribe. Please also hit those notification bells and check the description for various ways to keep this content coming to you. And as always, stay angry about space.